Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs, and in the case of this video, every D&D player's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continued support. This video is part 2 of a series on converting your characters from D&D 5th edition to Pathfinder 2nd edition. The first video, linked above, was about the Barbarian and the Bard. This video is going to be covering the Cleric and the Druid. If you haven't watched the first video, I recommend checking it out because I go over general guidelines for how to do these conversions as well, and I also talk about my template for how I'm doing these conversions. On to the video. So first up for today's video is the Cleric. And the Cleric translates over pretty easily from D&D. I know I said this about the Barbarian, I know I said this about the Bard. I swear some of the future classes will have hotter takes than it's easy to translate, but the Cleric is easy to translate. They have fundamentally very similar flavor. That being said, gameplay loops do tend to differ. Clerics in Pathfinder do have a few more options in how they're built. You might build a Cleric to be a bit more gishy. You might build them to be a bit more of a blaster. And while D&D does have those options, there's a lot more modularity in there on the Pathfinder side. You will also expect a bit more turn-by-turn variety, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, the first thing I want to talk about Clerics isn't actually unique to Clerics in Pathfinder. Any healer would find this true, but it's worth talking about because D&D Clerics are the ones that are seen as the healer if you go with the life subclass. Healing in Pathfinder is way stronger than in D&D. It's so much stronger. First off, healing spells fundamentally just heal for more in Pathfinder. Even after the buffs that D&D 5.5e gave healing, you should expect Pathfinder healing to have way higher numbers. And secondly, in D&D, healing has this problem where going unconscious isn't really a cost. You go unconscious at 0 HP, the Cleric casts Healing Word. You stand right back up, you use a free action to pick up your weapon, and you keep fighting. In Pathfinder, it's different. You go unconscious. First off, dropping everything you hold and going prone is a big cost. You now use an action to stand up. You use an action to pick up your weapon, and maybe you need to use an action to re-equip your shield or your second weapon if you had one. So you're spending somewhere between 2/3 and the entirety of your turn just recovering from the fact that you fell unconscious. Secondly, Pathfinder's recovery checks, which is the equivalent of death saving throws from D&D, are designed to punish you for going unconscious too often. Imagine if you were playing D&D and the death saving throws had the following rule. The first time you go unconscious, you have 0 failures and 0 successes, and it works as normal as it does in D&D. The second time, you automatically start with 1 failure and 0 successes, and it works as normal. The third time, you automatically start with 2 failures. And the fourth time, you start with 3 failures, which means you immediately die without ever getting to roll. Pathfinder's recovery checks work like this game's mechanical equivalent of what I just described for death saving throws in D&D, which is a brutal way to make sure that you do not keep standing back up. So popping back up and down in Pathfinder is just not a great idea for both of these reasons, the action economy cost and the wounded condition that makes it so hard for you to make recovery checks if you keep going down. So Pathfinder healers are encouraged to keep their friends up, not bring their friends up. And then the incredibly strong healing in Pathfinder really helps you get there. So healing just feels fantastic in this game. Now the next interesting difference to note is that Pathfinder clerics have very modular subclass choices compared to D&D. This may not be obvious at first. In D&D, you pick a domain. In Pathfinder, you pick a deity. That feels like a one-to-one equivalence, but it isn't. In D&D, you pick a divine order. In Pathfinder, you pick a doctrine, which may seem like a one-to-one equivalence, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So first, let's talk about the deity. The deity grants several different pieces of things that then differ from what other deities would grant. So first, it'll grant you your cleric spells. Now, clerics in Pathfinder usually get 3 spells from their deity, with a few exceptions. And that is a lot fewer spells than you would get from your domain in D&D. You will see why soon because of all the other things the deity gives you. The next thing the deity gives you is its domains, Most deities would come with 4 basic domains and a couple of alternate options that you may have to talk to your GM about, and these will grant your domain spells, which are focus spells. Thematically, these are very similar to channel divinities. Now you can already start to see the picture come together. In D&D, you pick one domain. For example, you might pick the knowledge domain, and that domain gives you its fixed set of spells, a class feature, and its channel divinity option. In Pathfinder, you pick a deity. That deity will then give you multiple domains, which you can then customize within. For example, you could have 2 clerics that both have Nethys as their deity. Nethys will give them both the same spells to add to their cleric spell lists, but one of them could pick the knowledge domain and the other could pick the destruction domain, and they will get 2 different sets of domain spells from those. Alternatively, destruction domain could have been associated with Nethys, like in this case, but it could also be associated with Ragathiel. Nethys being the god of magic and knowledge, but Ragathiel being a god of war. So you could pick up destruction domain from Ragathiel, and then Ragathiel will give you spells more appropriate to a war deity, whereas Nethys gave you more magic-themed spells like Force Barrage. Ragathiel will give you Shore Strike, which helps you hit better. So it's kind of like if in D&D you could pick the spell list and then pick which channel divinity you wanted. That's kind of what clerics in Pathfinder get to do. But there's more than that. Then there's an option called a divine font. It gives you what is basically your deity's signature granted spell. Usually the spell is either heal or harm. Heal is a spell that you can use to heal living or to hurt undead. Harm is a spell you can use to hurt the living or heal the undead. For example, a warrior deity might give you harm, but the deity of light will give you heal. There's also the option to get Bless, Bane, and 2 similar spells, Malediction and Benediction, from your font, but that's a separate topic. These castings are always at your maximum rank of spell slot, and you get a lot of those castings. So that is another gameplay defining feature that your deity is giving you. Some deities will even give you an option between heal or harm, and there's a feat that lets you take both, so you can see how you're customizing what you're getting from your deity depending on your exact character concept. And finally, you get a lot of smaller things from your deity. You get your divine skill, which is a skill proficiency relevant to your deity. You get a favored weapon, which is relevant if you want to be a weapon using cleric, because you're better at using that favored weapon than other weapons. And then you get your divine sanctification, which is basically you're either holy or unholy, and that makes you offensively better against things that are the opposite of you. So if you're holy, you're really good at hurting unholy things, and vice versa. But you're also likelier to take more damage from them. So your deity is offering a ton of options because there's so many different dimensions of what the deity is giving you. And then you pick the doctrine of your deity, which is basically a more extensive version of D&D's Divine Order. Divine Order really just offers one choice at level 1, and I believe it offers one more choice at level 9. I forget if that's the case or not. In Pathfinder, you can pick your doctrine to be something like Cloistered, in which case you will get a whole bunch of class features that make you better at being a cloth cleric. You'll be one that's focused more on spellcasting, staying in the backline. Or you can be a war priest, which makes you better at using armor and gives you the ability to use your deity's favored weapon pretty well, which will now mean you can be more of that war cleric equivalent from D&D. And finally, there is a Battle Harbinger doctrine, which makes you much more limited as a spellcaster. It limits your spell slots to a huge degree, but makes you incredibly good at using aura spells like Bless, Bane, Malediction, and Benediction. And it also makes you better at using weapons and armor than a war priest cleric. Notably, you don't have to use your deity's favorite weapon if you don't want to. So between all these choices, clerics actually have a ton of options, and you're kind of going to see the complexity of that when I talk about their subclass specifics. So we will be converting specific domains from D&D cleric to specific deities in Pathfinder. I will mention the relevant domains you should pick for that deity, but I won't always mention doctrine. I will only mention doctrine if it's specifically important to replicate a mechanic or a piece of flavor for one of the cleric domains we're talking about, because otherwise, in both D&D and Pathfinder, you can pick whichever divine order or doctrine you want for any given domain or deity. I will note, these deities are part of Golarion, the default universe of Pathfinder that Paizo publishes for. If you're playing in a game where the GM is using a homebrew setting or even a D&D setting like Forgotten Realms or Eberron, you won't have access to these exact deities, but if anyone wants to play a cleric in that game, the GM is going to have to manufacture a deity stat block anyways. So you can simply provide them this deity stat block, and you can ask them to assign the stat block to whatever deity is closest in the world that you're working with. And it would be a fair assumption that some deity is a good fit because you were planning on making a D&D cleric that would have been a good fit with that deity anyways. As always, first we'll talk about the easy translations. First up, Arcana and Knowledge Domain. They both map to Nethys, the deity of knowledge and magic in Golarion. The Arcana domain maps most closely to the Magic domain from Nethys, which will give you abilities that, for example, boost your allies' saves against magic, and Knowledge will map to Knowledge domain, which will make you really good at using Recall Knowledge as a skill with your Intelligence and Wisdom. So both of these map perfectly over. Nethys also will grant you way more spells than any other deity, which will really help you replicate the feel of both of these clerics very easily. Next up is Death Domain. Now the Death Domain in D&D is all about using necromantic energies and magic better than other clerics do. I would map this to Pharasma, the goddess of death. And of course you would pick the Death Domain to represent this character, and you would use a lot of spells that deal void damage. Void is basically necromantic damage in Pathfinder, and of course the iconic Harm spell is going to be great at dealing that. Harm is also something clerics are allowed to upgrade with their feats. You could pick up a feat that lets you exclude allies from an AoE harm. You could pick up a feat that makes enemies prone if they take any damage from your harm, even on a successful saving throw. So between all these, you can really replicate the mechanics of using necromantic magic all the time to hurt enemies directly. Then there's a Forge domain. This domain in D&D is all about using fire and smithing themed spells, as well as applying boosts to weapons and armor, either on yourself or your allies. Torag is the Golarion deity that you will be using for this. He is a dwarven deity associated with fire and smithing in a lot of ways, and if you pick his metal and fire domains, you will do a great job getting both the mechanics and the feel over for this character. Metal gives you the option to reshape weapons, either your own or your allies, to do more damage. Fire gives you the option to throw fire at enemies. I would recommend the Battle Harbinger Doctrine specifically for this character because it also gives you the ability to really make use of those battle auras really effectively, and that is another really cool way of representing the smithing flavor. I will say this is a little feat intensive because you need access to 2 different domains, you need access to Battle Harbinger, and the Battle Harbinger itself tends to want a couple feats to really get kicking, so it's a little expensive in terms of class feats to represent this. You can drop the Fire domain if that makes it easier, you can be a War Priest instead of Battle Harbinger if that makes it easier, but ultimately this character concept is going to work in one of many different ways. Next up is Life domain, the cleric that heals and gets amazing boosts to healing. Bolka, the dwarven goddess of love and family and encouragement, is the one you're going to go with. You could pick the healing domain, which unsurprisingly is going to make you much better of a healer than others, and just like the death domain cleric is upgrading their harm with feats, you can upgrade your heal with feats. Any cleric can choose to upgrade harm or heal, whatever they're focusing on, and that's a really nice piece of customization that you can really make use of to represent these character concepts. Next up is the light domain. This is the domain that's associated with light and fire in D&D, and notably gets to cast Fireball and use channel divinities that blast. This maps over to the deity Sarenrae in Golarion. You might know her as the Everlight from a certain other IP related to D&D. She will grant you fire and sun domain spells if you opt into them, which is more than sufficient to represent everything you need from a light domain cleric. She will also give you Fireball as a spell, so you also get that going. The fire domain will give you a focus spell you can blast with, and the sun domain will give you a focus spell that you can dazzle enemies with, and together that represents everything about the flavor and mechanics of the light cleric. Finally, there's the war cleric in D&D, and I would recommend going with the deity Ragathiel in Golarion. Unsurprisingly, Ragathiel is a war god. You can use a Zeal domain from Ragathiel to improve your weapon usage the way a war cleric in D&D would, and you should pick the War Priest Doctrine, but remember that War Priests are locked into their deity's favored weapon. If you have a weapon you're really attached to and Ragathiel or another similar deity you found don't do the trick, Be a Battle Harbinger, and that will get rid of that problem. You'll be able to use any weapon you want. Make sure to pick up Channel Smite as a feat, and then to pick up other feats that make your harm better, so that you can be really good at pumping your weapon with magic and hitting enemies with them. Next, flavor translates well, mechanics don't. Grave Domain is one such example. A few of the mechanics from Grave Domain, like the whole doubling damage thing that it can do, would just be plain old problematic in Pathfinder, so you don't really get to do that. Pick Pharasma, be the Death Domain Cleric. Thematically, this has you fully covered, because Pharasma is literally the guardian of the grave. She is the one who judges all souls in Golarion, and so you don't really need to worry about much else in terms of flavor. Once you have that, pick whatever options you like as a cleric. Next up is Nature Domain. Now again, a lot of the mechanics of the Nature Domain Cleric don't really map over well. For example, you're not going to be able to find a cleric that like regularly charms plants and animals, but you can be a Nature Domain Cleric worshipping a green man as a deity, and you will get lots of nature-themed stuff. You'll get nature-themed spells. You will get a focus spell that lets you cover yourself in vibrant thorns that hurt enemies who attack you. So all that green flavor, it's there, just not all the mechanics from the D&D character. Next up is the Peace Domain, a famously broken domain in D&D, and you're not going to be able to translate those mechanics over to Pathfinder. You're not going to be able to translate that pseudo-bless that isn't really bless, so it stacks with bless, thing that Peace Cleric has going on for it. You're not going to be able to teleport your friends around freely in Pathfinder. But you can be a Cleric of Nocticula. Nocticula is a former demon lord who is associated into a patron saint deity of redemption and artists. You can pick the introspection and protection domains and really represent that Peace Cleric flavor. Introspection will give you a spell that protects your friends from mental effects of certain kinds. Protection will give you spells that let you literally take damage for your friends, and I think that's a really good fit for a Peace Domain Cleric. Next up, Tempest Domain. Much like the Grave Cleric, where you can't just freely double your damage in Pathfinder, Tempest Cleric is in this section because you cannot just do maximum damage instead of rolling in Pathfinder the way a Tempest Domain in D&D can. But you could definitely create a really good lightning blaster with Rul. Rul is the orcish deity of storms, and you can pick up the air domain, the lightning domain, and the destruction domain, optionally, to really wreak havoc with storm-like magic. You will push enemies around, you will throw lightning javelins at them, you will create massive cones of pure destruction, and of course, Rule will give you a lot of the cool lightning spells like Thunderstrike, Lightning Bolt, and Chain Lightning. So you will get every aspect of a lightning-y cleric, you just won't get to max out your damage whenever you choose, like D&D Tempest clerics do. Next up is the Trickery and Twilight domains. I mapped them together because a lot of their thematics have overlap. The specific mechanics of these, hard to replicate. The Trickery Cleric gets a clone in D&D, which isn't really something you can do with clerics in Pathfinder. The Twilight Cleric gets to break the game in half in D&D, which clerics don't really get to do in Pathfinder. I would recommend picking the deity Daxerol. I don't know how to pronounce that, that's my best guess. If you're a Trickery Cleric, I would say you should pick the Luck and Trickery domains. And if you're a Twilight Cleric, I would say you should pick the Darkness and Trickery domains. The focus spells of all of these domains will do a really good job representing the flavor of Trickery or Twilight. You'll be able to create areas of darkness, you'll be able to reposition yourself because you're so tricksy, but you won't get exact replicas of either of those subclasses mechanics. Continuing with the cleric list, next up is the doesn't translate well, consider a different class section. The Order Cleric from D&D doesn't really translate well to Pathfinder. Yes, you can get some of those thematics on, say, an Asmodeus Cleric, and you can. But ultimately, I put the Order class here because there is an Order domain warrior who's also divine in this game, the Champion. The Champion is Pathfinder's rough equivalent of the Paladin with a lot more thematic scope, and the Obedience Champion is the one that's like, I impose order. You must obey me. Now, I know that sounds a little evil when I say it that way, but obedience doesn't have to be something evil. Obedience and order have a lot of thematic overlap, and mechanically, this champion's going to do a really good job making you feel like you're trying to force your enemies to obey you. So I really recommend going this route instead of going with one of the cleric options I talked about. Now, what about the completely new stuff in Pathfinder? Because of the way their subclasses work, Pathfinder clerics have an infinite looking amount of choice compared to D&D ones. There are 63 domains, and you can get whatever combination of these 63 domains from 422 different deities in Golarion. So this just gives you so much to play with. I mentioned a metal domain earlier and a fire domain. There's also domains for other elements. There are just so many things you can do with your cleric in Pathfinder thanks to the way their subclasses are built out. Secondly, clerics aren't the only divine casters in Pathfinder. In D&D, if you want to be a divine caster, you're either a cleric or a specific subclass of one of the other casters. Like you might be a celestial patron warlock or a divine soul sorcerer, and you'll get a little bit of that divine flavor, but otherwise you'll still mostly be a sorcerer, mostly be a warlock. In Pathfinder, there's 2 other spellcasters that just are divine, and I feel the need to mention that because some of them can represent character concepts that we talked about in the previous slide, perhaps better than the cleric in some ways, depending on exactly what you want. So first is the animist. The animist represents a more spiritual and shamanistic relationship with your deity. Clerics are the ones who have a direct, doctrine-focused relationship. Animists don't really worship a specific deity. They can in terms of flavor, but their power manifests in terms of apparitions that they draw from. This means that any clerics who have some kind of elemental or naturey or primal flavor from the previous slides would work really well as animists. That covers Forge, Life, Light, Nature, Twilight, and War clerics. They'll work really well with this class. There's also the Oracle. The Oracle represents a more indirect, mysterious relationship with your deity. Again, not really weighed down by doctrine. Oracles don't have to have a relationship with the deity. That's just an option for them. For example, your Cosmos Oracle might not have a relationship with any specific deity. They're just pulling power from the fabric of the universe itself. But also, they could just have their relationship with Nyarlathotep, and that's amazing and cool. Light, Tempest, and War are the domains that have direct equivalents in Oracle mysteries. There are mysteries for way more, like I mentioned, a Cosmos domain, but these are the ones that are directly equivalent to D&D cleric domains. So if the clerics I talked about in the previous slide are just not hitting it for you, check out the Animus, check out the Oracle. There might be something in there that actually fits your character concept a little bit better. Between all of these options, the Pathfinder clerics having so many domains and deities, the Animus and the Oracle having so much customization, you have hundreds of divine character combinations that aren't possible in D&D. You can do so much with this system in terms of making a divine caster. And D&D's list of divine domains for the cleric, it's extensive. It just is somehow still much smaller than what you'll be able to do between the cleric, animus, and oracle in Pathfinder. Even for those options I talked about in the previous slides, the ones where we're directly translating over from D&D, there might be other deities that give you other combinations of options. Maybe Rule is not quite the storm deity you want. Maybe you want Kernunos or Chamidu. Depending on what you're envisioning your character as, they might represent these character combinations better than what I picked. I just picked what I pictured when I saw those cleric domains. You may not picture the same, so explore the depth of the cleric options. There's truly so much more in there that you can explore. Next up is the Druid, and this is the first of the classes where I'm going to tell you the flavor is quite different between Pathfinder and D&D Druids. If you were to summarize them both in a word, you would say Nature Mage, which superficially sounds similar. But D&D Druids aren't really Nature Mages. They don't feel like it to me. They feel like shifters. D&D's Druids feel like shifters who happen to cast some spells. Wild Shape is a huge chunk of the flavor of what D&D Druids get to do. They have several class features that talk about Wild Shape. That is their primary short rest resource, and that to me makes D&D Druids flavor feel kind of like it's not landing. And to be clear, I'm not just talking in terms of variety. When I was talking about the cleric, D&D has like 15 domains for the cleric and Pathfinder has 63 domains for clerics. But I didn't count that as a downside for the D&D cleric. All the domains that exist for the D&D cleric are thematic and fun and cool, and they really feel fundamentally like the fantasy they're selling. The D&D Druid doesn't feel like the Nature Mage fantasy it's selling. Pathfinder has a much larger variety of nature mages that can be represented, and they actually feel like what they're trying to tell you. A Storm Order Druid really feels like they're a Druid of lightning and storms. A Flames Order Druid really feels like a Fire Druid. Whereas D&D Druids, it's quite hit or miss. I'll get into why when I talk more about the mechanics a little later. I will also note that mechanically, Druids will be doing a ton of different nature-y things in Pathfinder. A much larger variety. You can be blasting, healing, controlling the battlefield, protecting your allies, summoning friends, polymorphing yourself, and a lot of these have a larger variety of flavors within them. For example, if you're interested in polymorphing, it's not like there's just one singular polymorph spell that you receive when you reach level 7 that lets you turn into beasts. There is a spell that lets you take animal forms. There's a spell that lets you take dragon forms. There's a spell that lets you just take on elemental forms like metal or fire. You can be like Toph in the finale of Avatar: The Last Airbender, where you're just in a purely metallic form beating people up. So there's a huge variety of nature mage flavor you can represent with the Pathfinder Druid. One mechanical thing to note is that the primal spell list is way stronger than the D&D Druid spell list. First off, blasting is natively well supported. You don't need patches from your subclass to make blasting work. In D&D, Druids don't get Fireball, and they don't get a lot of the decent blasts. And that can suck because D&D, aside from a handful of the good blasting spells, doesn't really support blasting that much. So Druids are really pushed into that summoning playstyle or polymorphing playstyle if they want to deal damage, which again kind of goes into how I think D&D Druids don't deliver on their fantasy. Pathfinder, on the other hand, you can build a Druid and you can say, because I'm a nature mage, I am kind of like the Avatar, and you will feel like the Avatar when you do it. Then there's the fact that healing, being naturally stronger in Pathfinder, just like the Cleric, benefits Druids a lot too. In D&D, if you want to be a healing Druid, you have to be a Circle of Stars Druid, and the healing you do is still not going to be great. In Pathfinder, get the heal spell, the end of conversation. You are now a fantastic healer. You don't really need to be talking much more about this. And finally, the primal spell list in Pathfinder has more unique spells that no one else gets compared to any of the other spell lists in Pathfinder, more than even Arcane. And that can really help sell the fantasy of being a Druid. Now, I have been gushing about the primal spell list a lot, and I did mention summoning both in context of Pathfinder and D&D, so I am going to note one weakness of the primal spell list, and while summoning in general in Pathfinder, summoning doesn't feel great. If you want to cast summon spells, not only are they not as overpowered as the D&D spells that you're probably used to, they're actually obtuse and hard to use compared to other Pathfinder spells. They take a lot of work to get right. They don't fire those feel-good brainwaves when you use them. You're just kind of like, what's happening? Even if you're doing something mechanically effective, they may not feel that good. So summoning is unfortunately not as well supported as the other nature mage playstyles that Druids get, but all the other playstyles are way better supported than in D&D. And the next mechanical difference is my biggest pet peeve with D&D's Druid. It's the reason I feel like D&D kind of cheats you out of the Druid fantasy. Pathfinder Druids are not forced to polymorph into animals at any point. D&D Druids are. D&D Druids get a ton of features related to polymorphing into animals, so if for flavor reasons you choose not to use it, you're letting go of a big portion of your class. Now, to be clear, there is an option to make polymorphing your go-to short rest thing that you do as a Druid. There is a subclass for that. It's just you're not forced to use it if you don't like it or if that's not part of your character's fantasy. And unlike the D&D Druid, you now don't need those patches to use your own resource. D&D Druids get Wild Shape, a resource that's fundamentally about turning into a goat, and then at level 3, their circle gives them some other way to use their Wild Shape that's not turning into a goat. In Pathfinder, you just get a different thing to do with your resource. You just don't get the whole turning into a goat thing in the first place. And you get those features right at level 1, just like any other Pathfinder subclass, so you don't have to wait till level 3 to use something that was promised to you at level 1 when you read the flavor text of your character. Crazy, I know. One more note, there's the Wild Companion feature in D&D, where you can use your Wild Shape to get a familiar. In Pathfinder, druids can just pick up familiars just like most other spellcasters via a feat, so you don't need this special feature to use your resource. Familiars aren't actually something that costs a resource in Pathfinder. So all of these factors make me think that if you're converting a D&D druid into a Pathfinder druid, you have opened up so many possibilities, because you can drop a lot of baggage that the D&D druid imposed on you and just pick the things you like, pick the things that are good for your character, and just don't bother translating the mechanics you didn't want in the first place. So now, to talk about specific druidic circles in D&D and converting them to orders in Pathfinder. Note, just like the bard, the druid is allowed to use a feat that gives them a second order, or a third order if they wish. Easy translations from D&D. First, Circle of the Land. Now, the biggest, most defining feature of the Circle of the Land druid in D&D is getting spells that any good nature mage should be able to cast. Seriously, like that's their whole defining feature. What? Anyways, because druids just get all the spells you would expect a nature mage to have in Pathfinder, you don't need to translate that feature. If you wanted to attune to the land that lets you pick Fireball on one day, just prepare Fireball on that day on your druid spell list in Pathfinder. If you were going to pick the land that gave you Slow, which I think is a reflavor of Cold Magic in this specific case, you just pick Slow on your spell list as a druid in Pathfinder. I think the only spell I couldn't get an equivalent of is Misty Step. I don't know what the exact flavor is for the land type that gets Misty Step. I think it's just a generic Fey association, or maybe it's supposed to be more like the land is helping you move really fast. That being said, Pathfinder druids have a ton of spells that help them move around really fast. They just don't have exactly a teleportation. There are so many spells that do it. There is Tailwind, there's Repulsive Breeze, there's Airlift. All of these are air-themed spells that move you really fast. There's Blazing Dive, a fire-themed spell that moves you really fast. The Wave Order druid specifically gets a water-themed focus spell that lets you move around really fast. So while you may not get exactly Misty Step, you can definitely get the flavor that is replicating and a lot of mechanical advantages, even if they're not exactly teleportation. So Circle of the Land, easily translated because their biggest feature is spells that feel nature-y. They also get that use of Wild Shape that gives them a nature kind of blast. You can pick any combination of the Flame, Leaf, Stone, Storm, or Wave orders to get exactly the kind of blast you want your druid to get. So for example, you might pick Stone Order at level 1, and you will get the ability to use the ground and have it crush enemies. And then by level 6, you might take something like Wave Order spell, where you just drown a bunch of people in a blasting wave. So you can get that wild shape usage that the land druid gets, but you could represent it in a lot of different ways, including just a small blast if you wish, so it's no biggie. Then there's the Moon Druid, the druid that's all about polymorphing into an animal, except it actually should be doing so, unlike all these other druids who for some reason have a bunch of features about polymorphing into an animal. In Pathfinder, you would play an Untamed Order druid. You get a focus spell that lets you polymorph, then you turn into an animal and hit people with it. As you level up, you gain more and more forms. And both the Moon Druid and the Untamed Order druid, while they can polymorph into something dangerous, stronger than a spellcaster in melee, they don't get to outshine martials in melee. So you would still be using your other spells for other naturey stuff and then polymorphing whenever that feels appropriate. Next up is the Stars Druid. The Stars Druid is actually my favorite subclass of Druid in D&D. Their flavor is that you surround yourself in a constellation of stars that lets you either shoot magical arrows or heal your friends. And this is a fun one. So pick whatever druidic order you like. It doesn't really matter. I guess in terms of flavor, you might maybe pick Storm Druid. That feels the most appropriate. And then pick the Starlit Sentinel archetype. The Starlit Sentinel archetype is basically a magical girl archetype. You surround yourself in a constellation. It gives you a bunch of cool things. You get that range attack like the Archer form for the Stars Druid. You can get some kinds of healing. You can get an AoE damage option. It's a great way to represent all the mechanics of Stars Druid. Now, the Dragon form specifically for the Stars Druid does not translate over because Pathfinder doesn't have concentration. So there's nothing to do there. You can't have a form that makes you good at concentration checks. And finally, Wildfire Druid. The Wildfire Druid in D&D is strongly associated with fire, and it has a companion that's a fire elemental. easily represented in Pathfinder. You basically want two orders: the Flame Order, which will give you fire-themed focus spells, and the Animal Order, which will give you an Animal Companion. So in Pathfinder, Animal Companions are something Druids and Rangers can natively choose to get via their own class, although anyone can pick an Animal Companion via archetyping. Now, Animal Companions are a lot less generic in Pathfinder than they are in D&D. For example, the Beastmaster Ranger in D&D really just gets Beast of the Land, Beast of the Sky, Beast of the Sea. In Pathfinder, you choose a specific animal, and there's a lot of options. You can have a horse, you can have a drake, you can have a bear. There's just a ton of options. You even have options for weird stuff like mammoths and megafauna of that kind. And you have options for elementals. So you just pick the fire elemental animal companion on a flame order druid, and you're set. You have represented all the thematics and mechanics that you want. Next up, flavor translates well, mechanics don't. So Circle of the Sea Druids in D&D, aside from getting a few water-themed spells, their main feature is the ability to create that watery aura where they do some damage and force movement. Wave Order Druids don't get an exact match of such a feature, but they get a ton of cool water focus spells where they can move around really quickly, they can deal a bunch of blasting damage, and so on. So the flavor translates perfectly. Next up, Shepherd Druid. Now, obviously, with this, we have to be talking about D&D 5e, not 5.5e, because technically the Shepherd Druid does not have its class features functioning in D&D 5.5e. Since the flavor is all about summoning as many animals as possible, you want to be an Animal Order Druid to have that one main animal companion that you use, and then alongside that animal companion, you will use spells like Animal Allies, Summon Animal, and specifically Summon Animal anytime it lets you summon a swarm of some kind. The Cinder Swarm spell that has the flavor of fire ants or fireflies helping you fight. You can use any combination of these spells to replicate the idea that you have a lot of animals helping you fight, not just this one, but of course it's not a perfect mechanical translation. And finally, the Spores Druid. There is a Spore Order in Pathfinder. It's a variant of the Leaf Order, and you get a really cool focus spell that's about mushrooms that cause hallucinations in enemies. But ultimately, that's not the flavor of the Spores Druid in 5e. The Spores Druid in 5e is kind of a gish, where the mushrooms empower you into a stronger form, and then you can raise enemies as necromantic allies. That doesn't really cross over to Pathfinder. You can play a Spore Order Druid, and optionally you can use an archetype to get some kind of an undead minion, and that's a good way to represent the flavor, but the mechanics are not really mapping one-to-one. And finally, things that don't translate well at all, and you should be looking at a different class. The Circle of Dreams Druid is the only example of this. The flavor is strongly associated with Fae, which Druids don't have a specific order for, though again, you can always flavor any of your primal magic as coming from the Fae. And then the Circle of Dreams Druid has a bit of mechanics around healing allies, creating areas of shadow, and so on. I would recommend playing an Animus for this. There are a couple aberrations that map over perfectly: Monarch of the Fae Courts and Echo of Lost Moments. And then to replicate the rest of the flavor, you can either use your spells, you can just cast heal from your spell slots, or you can use other apparitions alongside these ones. For example, the Custodian of Gardens and Groves will give you a lot of cool healing as a focus spell. As before, nature revives in Pathfinder are not associated with teleporting. That's a very Fae thing in D&D, so you're not going to get that teleportation feature that Dreams Druids do, but you will get other forms of propelling your own movement via your spells. And finally, completely new stuff in Pathfinder. So I've already talked about all the cool things Druids can do, but can I talk about the Kineticist? The Kineticist is an elemental-themed class, which is amazing for nature vibes if that's what you want. And it means you can opt out of the spell casting system if that's not really fitting your character concept. If you don't want to be using spell slots, if you don't want to be preparing your spells daily, you can play a Kineticist. And there are so many cool combinations of options. There's even a wood element, which means despite the fact that you're an elementalist, you can still do things like summoning trees and whatnot, which really do fit nature vibes very well. So whenever you're translating a druid over, if somehow nothing in Pathfinder's druid is doing it for you, consider the Kineticist and the Animus. Both of these will have excellent options to cover so many more character concepts. That'll be all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed watching me talk about the Cleric and the Druid, and how to convert them to Pathfinder. I hope you enjoyed my little rant about how much I dislike the D&D Druid. If you want to learn about any of the other classes, you can check out the first video that's already out, or any of the upcoming videos that I'll be talking about in the future. If you like my content, please like, comment, and subscribe. The engagement really helps support me and ensure that I can keep going with the content and making sure that it reaches the people that it needs to reach. If you can, please join a channel membership. It's a very quick and direct way to support me, and as more videos come out, I plan to release some perks for channel members. I've been Mathfinder, folks, and I'll see you next time.